Hello and welcome everybody to this second episode of our exploration of the MCU multiverse. In this video we're going to take a deep dive into how Marvel set up the foundations for their multiverse by examining Loki and try to answer questions like how do timelines even work and where was Loki at the end of season 1? Oh, and just to be clear, last time we already established a lot of groundwork for what's coming, so be sure to check out our Endgame video so you don't miss anything. With that being said, roll the intro! Loki Season 1 expanded on what Endgame established for the multiverse in some big ways. So in order to cover it all in a coherent way, let's start from the beginning. Throughout the MCU's history, we viewed all interconnected movies as one single timeline. In Endgame, however, we learned that going back in time creates branches diverging from the quote main timeline, resulting in what we can understand as parallel universes. This is supported by one of the biggest lectures in Multiversal History 101, He Who Remains' monologue at the end of episode 6.
He was a scientist and he discovered that there were universes stacked on top of his own.
Oh, and just so that we're all on the same page here, we're going to assume that He Who Remains is actually supposed to be Kang. And overall, Kang is just way easier to say than He Who Remains. Cool? Cool. Okay, so the people in those parallel universes are essentially copies of their counterparts in other universes, and as Ms. Minutes explained, we call those variants. So, as Kang tells us, the other versions of himself started this massive multiversal war in the 31st century, a war that he won and now has sworn to prevent by preventing these other versions of himself from being born in the first place. So how does he do that? After the war, he quote isolated his own timeline, effectively starting with a clean slate. One universe, no branches. Which of course is what we know as the MCU timeline. But as Sylvie put it, the universe wants to break free, so it manifests chaos, which is why eventually branches started to diverge off of this single timeline. Now to be fair, I don't think that the universe as a character is responsible for any of that. It's just more a thing that happens due to, say, entropy if you will. But the point stands, the sacred timeline started to branch. And each of these branches now has the potential to result in a future where a variant of Kang is born, which would lead to another multiversal war and so on and so forth. So this is why Kang wants to effectively eliminate those branches. In order to do that, he created the TVA and tasked them with eliminating those branches by pruning them. But what if not all of these branches would result in a future where a variant of Kang is born? Those branches would therefore not lead to a multiversal war down the line, which means they could be ignored. We actually do get to see some branches that coexist next to the main one. I mean, think about it. We know that the TVA needs to show up in quote real time if a branch pops up in order to be able to prune it. In episode 1, we learned that growth rate and slope are apparently important when it comes to branches forming, and in episode 2 we get to see a rate and slope that tells the Minutemen that they are working with a rather limited time window. This means that the TVA wasn't immediately on high alert once Sylvie's branch formed, since from what we're shown, they go in on a given branch right after it pops up on their graph right here, meaning each branch they prune has had very little time to form. We're talking about hours here. Sylvie, however, was arrested at a minimum age of 10 years, and mind you, Jotunheim people age similarly to Asgardians, meaning that she could have been several hundred years old by the time of her arrest. So this can only mean one thing, that the TVA only prunes branches once they need to. And I even think you could make the case that most of them aren't even aware that those ignorable branches exist because 1, they don't really need to since they are no danger because they don't result in a future Kang variant, and 2, all they ever really get to see in the TVA is this single timeline graph. But even if higher-ups like say Renslayer would know about these branches, at least on some level they seem to not care, because the same line of argumentation can be done for all other fully grown versions of Loki we get to see in the show. Like for example Hulk Loki or Kid Loki or Classic Loki, who hid on a planet for years before they came for him. Plus we literally get to see the quote sacred timeline acting more as a sort of rope of strings with multiple lines running in parallel to one another rather than just this single timeline it's made out to be by the TVA's visual. But that of course still leaves us with the branches that are getting pruned, the ones that do lead to a variant of Kang being born. What makes a branch come into existence in the first place? We can take a look at this line by Miss Minutes in episode 1. Maybe you started an uprising or were just late for work. Whatever it was, stepping off your path created a Nexus event, which, left unchecked, could branch off into madness, leading to another Multiversal War. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, so let's go through it one by one. This first part right here tells us that there is in fact such a thing as free will in the MCU. You can actually choose to go down a different path than the one you were supposed to follow. If you do, you create a branch because you've changed something, and the important part right here is that the size of the change itself doesn't actually matter at all, but the impact it has on the future of the branch, its effects, that's what matters. And this is where this second part right here comes into play. Okay, so the last part right here is pretty obvious. If you change something and that change somehow leads to a Kang variant being born, then Multiversal War and yada yada, you get the drill. The first part, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting. It tells us that our change, which made the timeline branch in the first place, is called a Nexus event. And the thing with those is that if they are left unchecked, they could branch off into madness, and so on and so forth. Okay, so first we have this check part and then the could part. But here's the thing. In the show, every branch TVA visits ends up getting pruned. That's of course not a problem per se for the checking. That could also still take place beforehand in the office, for example, or we just don't get to see it at all because we're following this particular story. But the could part, on the other hand, handily supports our theory that, again, some branches are in fact harmless and do not have to be pruned. Let's see how all of this plays out from the perspective of the TVA. Imagine you're Mobius, doing your daily checkups on the sacred timeline. You're in the TVA, which is somewhere outside of the timeline, which is why you can see the whole timeline, past to future, in one picture. Say it's Monday and you decide to follow Kid Loki and his brother Thor. Loki, being the trickster he is, disguises himself as a snake to fool his brother, who just so happens to love snakes. Loki scares him and stabs him, because that's just what he does, leaving his brother sad and snakeless and with a knife in his tummy. Luckily though, he recovers, while Loki gets detention, and so they continue to grow up together and become the characters we know and love. Every event on the timeline happened as it should, as it always has, and you as Mobius are happy. Now Tuesday comes by and you do your daily checkup again, but this time something unexpected happens. Some way, somehow, Loki stabs Thor differently and he dies. This of course is a big change to what's supposed to happen. Thor can now not grow up to be the hero who helps fight the Chitauri or the Dark Elves or Hela or Thanos. All these things will happen differently on that branch that has now been created. And as time moves on, the absence of Thor continues to affect more and more people, and things change further as the branch diverges further from the main timeline. The stabbing becomes a Nexus event since it created the branch, and if that branch turns out to be dangerous because Kid Thor's death somehow leads to the birth of a Kang variant in the future of that branch, the TVA shows up to prune it, undoing the change and eliminating the branch. Did any of that sound familiar? Well, that's because that's basically what happened to Kid Loki. Okay, so change clearly matters. The show even makes a specific point out of this by having Sylvie literally hide within apocalypses, since the change you create there ends up getting wiped away anyways. And we also get another indicator for the importance of change with these TVA visuals. See, in the moment that Loki and Sylvie spend on Lamentis, two variants of the same person falling for each other, create such a big change on the timeline that it's even visible on the screen despite the incoming apocalypse. Furthermore, look at how steep this angle is here. This change makes the branch diverge from the main timeline in such a steep angle that the TVA has to rush in fast in order to be able to still prune it in time. Later on in the show, we of course learn that pruning is not actually this ultimate form of elimination it's made out to be, as Rensley explains. When we prune a branched reality, it's impossible to destroy all of its matter, so we move it to a place on a timeline where it won't continue growing. Basically, the branch timeline isn't reset, it's transferred. To where? A void at the end of time, where every instance of existence collides at the same point and simply stops. Because as Kang puts it, a being capable of consuming time and space itself, aka Alioth, eats it. What does actually end up in the void? Here, for example, it's a ship with its crew, which means that they changed something. Their course, for example, from what it would usually have been on the main timeline. And apparently this change would somehow result in the birth of a Kang variant. But hold on. From what we used to think about how pruning works, wouldn't that mean that the entire parallel universe should end up here? That's why the TVA has to come in real time, because this way they can transfer all the matter affected by said change to the void before its effects spread further and affect more matter. Only the changed stuff ends up in here. The rest of the branch doesn't need to be transferred since it didn't change yet. This also makes redlining make way more sense. As Loki states, if a branch crosses the red line, the TVA can no longer reset the Nexus event, because by that point so much matter on the branch got affected by the change that transferring it all wouldn't be possible anymore. Okay, so that's all fair and good and all, but just because we've removed the changed matter from the branch doesn't really mean the branch itself is gone, right? Fair point. Good on you for keeping track. Okay, so here's the thing. Technically, none of the characters mentioned any of this, but show creator Kate Herron explained in an interview that we can apparently see some branches merging into one another right about here. Now I don't know what any of this means for just any two random branches, I'd imagine a lot of chaos, but if we go back to the timeline visual right here, where we can see how a greater amount of change results in a branch diverging further from the main timeline, if we'd get rid of everything that makes this branch different from the main timeline, aka remove the change, I could see how that would bring the two of them closer together again, and maybe even allow for them to merge, which is to say the branch collapsing into the main timeline, which wouldn't even change anything for the main timeline, since all the change from the branch got removed. At the end of the day though, we know this. From the TVA's perspective, pruning works. And whether branches ultimately are capable of merging or not, it at least seems to work so far as to prevent any further problems in terms of the future birth of a Kang variant, which at last is all it's really intended to do. Well, obviously it got pruned, right? But the better question is, how much of it? See, there's actually two possibilities here, and they're both tied to Sylvie's Nexus event. Number 1. There actually was a Nexus event caused by Kid Loki shortly before her arrest. This would make sense from everything else we've seen so far in the show. However, it would also mean that the Nexus event caused a second branch to emerge from the first one, meaning that the pruning would have effectively only eliminated the second branch with the first one still being out there. Now our Sylvie wouldn't be able to go and hide there, of course, since there would already be a Sylvie on that branch, the one that didn't cause the Nexus event. Much like our OG Loki, who is still on the main timeline in Asgard's prison as in Thor 2. Which brings us to our second option. Sylvie didn't actually change anything and did what she was supposed to. It's just that the change she would inevitably cause due to her mere existence took some time to take full effect, resulting in no second branch, but a sort of bend, and a sudden increase in change on the first one. We've already seen bends like these on the show, so it wouldn't be too out of left field, but it would of course mean that the pruning affected her whole branch, removing the entire change her existence caused and effectively destroying the entire branch. The thing of course is that at this point both options seem valid, and with Sylvie and Renslayer having an open-ended discussion about this in Season 1, we may get some answers to this in Season 2. But for now, we're left with the real question here. Where's Loki now? Now this is where it gets really interesting, because the end of Loki Season 1 sure as hell has got some big ramifications in store for the bigger Marvel multiverse. For one, Kang's dead, rest in peace. But without wanting to seem too disrespectful here, the even more interesting thing happened shortly before his death. He lost control, meaning for the first time in a long time, he had no clue what was going on anymore. We had that little timeline cracking sound, and by the looks of things, Wanda's probably got something to do with that. But don't worry, we'll get to that when we get to Multiverse of Madness. Because for now, we're following our favorite god of mischief, Loki, who was just pushed through the time door that Sylvie opened back to the TVA, where neither Mobius nor Hunter B-15 have any idea who he is, and the Timekeeper statue got replaced with one displaying Kang. Oh boy, what's going on here? Well, the go-to answer would obviously be that the TVA changed, since with Kang gone, nobody's preventing the other versions of him from being born anymore. So clearly one of them founded the TVA, which would explain the statue and why Mobius and Hunter B-15 have no memory of Loki, since from their point of view, they never met. But isn't the TVA supposed to be outside of time and would therefore not be able to be influenced by events that would happen on the timeline, like the birth of a Kang variant for example? Well, what if it's not the same TVA? Remember, Kang isolated his timeline, meaning there are still likely others out there. And shortly before his death, he even mentions that the timeline is, quote, exposed now. So does that mean that on some other timeline outside OG Kang's circle, some other version of Kang also created his own version of the TVA in his image? And that TVA would look mostly the same, save for the statue, but then also have both Mobius and Hunter B-15 variants working there? Maybe. I guess we'll find that out in Season 2. But till then, what do you guys think? Is there only one TVA or are there multiple? Leave us your theories in the comments down below. Next time we're going to investigate how the other versions of Peter Parker, Tobey's and Andrew's version, fit into this whole variant system, and what their existence implies for the Marvel Multiverse. And as always, thank you so much for watching, it really means a lot. Leave us your thoughts in the comments down below, and subscribe so you can join us next time when we explore the canon of your favorite cosmic. Goodbye.